Hello, this is Chris Ferrara for Fatima Perspectives, the Fatima Network's commentary on current affairs in the Catholic Church. In previous segments, I've been discussing the, really, to be frank, disaster of Synod 2014 and the upcoming Synod in 2015, which threatens to become a Titanic, basically, in terms of doctrine and practice, because of the threat of changing the bimillennial discipline of the Church regarding the impossibility of admitting to Holy Communion divorced and remarried Catholics who, as our Lord himself insists, are living in a state of public adultery. Obviously, people in such a state, unless they alter their relationship to avoid the benefits of the marital relationship involving sexuality, cannot possibly approach the Blessed Sacrament, because objectively they're in a state of mortal sin. Again, we see, as the second session of the Synod approaches, the potential to revisit this issue and a disastrous change in discipline that would undermine the very idea of mortal sin itself as a bar to the reception of the sacraments. I've noted in the previous segments the role of Cardinal Burke as a courageous defender of the Church's traditional doctrine and practice. I've mentioned as well how, since his rather brutal demotion by Pope Francis from the head of the Apostolic Signatura, which is the Church's highest tribunal, to a ceremonial position as the spiritual advisor to the Knights of Malta, Cardinal Burke has continued his mission of courageously defending church teaching and related church discipline. And he said other things as well about the state of the Church today, things that needed to be said by a prince of the Church, even if they have been said repeatedly in many venues by lay commentators and lower-ranked members of the hierarchy. One thing he said in particular that sparked a firestorm of criticism from the liberal press was his observation, and I'm quoting him, that the radical feminism, which has assaulted the Church and society since the 1960s, has, he said, strongly influenced the Church, leading the Church constantly to address women's issues at the expense of addressing issues important to men. And this, said the Cardinal, has been accompanied by a complete collapse of catechesis in the Church. In other words, instruction of the young and adult converts in the basic truths of the faith. They are no longer taught the faith. And this, combined with this process of feminizing the Church, has involved what he says, a fluffy, superficial kind of catechetical approach to the question of human sexuality and the nature of the marital relationship. In the sanctuary, liturgically speaking, notes Cardinal Burke, and I'm quoting him again, apart from the priest, the sanctuary has become full of women. Who hasn't seen that in a typical parish where the new liturgy is celebrated? He went on to say the activities in the parish and even the liturgy have been influenced by women and have become so feminine in many places that men do not want to get involved. End quote. Now that landed like a bombshell among the liberal media, who began attacking the Cardinal as a reactionary throwback to the dark ages before the Second Vatican Council. And it is curious, of course, how the liberal press is very, very concerned that the Church move forward with the so-called renewal of the Second Vatican Council, because the liberal press understands that the best way to neutralize the Catholic Church is this so-called conciliar reform, which has produced, as Cardinal Burke so rightly notes, a feminization of the liturgy and a total collapse in vocations as a result. There are fewer priests in the world today than there were 50 years ago. That's how bad the vocations crisis is in the Catholic Church. And a major contributor to that vocations crisis, arising from the feminization of the Church, has been the rather horrendous novelty of girl altar boys, which John Paul II made the mistake of permitting as an exception to the rule, and in the post-conciliar Church, the exception to the rule becomes mandatory, whereas the rule becomes optional. So now, in most parishes, we see altar girls, and as a result, boys are not interested in altar service, and altar service being the traditional proving ground for vocations, having been taken away from young boys, there's a corresponding collapse in the number of vocations. Now, one priest, following the lead of Cardinal Burke, who rightly decries the undue feminization of the church, even in the liturgy, has taken a courageous step of his own. Father Joseph Illo, in the Catholic parish of Star of the Sea in San Francisco, has said that henceforth he will train only boys for service at the altar. As Father Illo explained this decision, it's a matter of self-defense and self-preservation for the church, because he observed what other priests have observed. When girls were allowed to serve at the altar, girls begin to predominate, boys lose interest, boys stop serving at the altar, vocations dry up. For Father Illo and for other priests who recognize the problem, this is a matter of preservation of the church's life itself, which comes from the priestly vocations, most of which derive from service at the altar. Now, in taking this decision, Father Illo, like Cardinal Burke, came under attack from the mass media. And here I would quote something else that Cardinal Burke said in defense of the idea that since the priesthood is configured to the male by the example of Christ and the apostles themselves, altar service should be configured to the male. He said this in defense of that. If this altar boy policy bothers us, said the Cardinal, we must ask ourselves if we have not unconsciously accepted the errors of the current age, specifically that the differences between men and women have no more spiritual significance than plumbing arrangements. And then he asked a very provocative question. And anyone who considers this question in good faith would have to admit that the Cardinal has a point. Do you think, he asked, that Mary, the Mother of God, would want to serve the Mass or be a priest? And even if so, why did Jesus not include her at the Last Supper? So what the Cardinal is saying here is that there is a danger to which large elements of the church have succumbed of going along with the German word for it is the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. And Dietrich von Hildebrand, the great Catholic philosopher of the 20th century, put it this way. He said, the spirit of our epoch is slowly penetrating the church herself, and many have failed to see the apocalyptic decline of our time. End quote. Dietrich von Hildebrand was called a 20th century doctor of the church by no less than Pope Pius XII. And what he says is, of course, true, that the spirit of the world is penetrating the church. We saw it at the Synod in 2014. We see another preparation for a further injection of the spirit of the world into the church at the upcoming Synod in 2015. It is this that Cardinal Burke is so courageously opposing. It is this that we as Catholics have to oppose, because the church is meant to be a sign of contradiction to the spirit of the age, not to go along with it. And this succumbing of the human element of the church to the spirit of the age is perhaps the greatest threat she has ever faced in her history. For Fatima Perspectives, this is Chris Ferrara. I'll see you again soon. God bless you.